Okay, now sharing my screen, so hopefully you can all see that. So firstly, as always, thank you to our sponsors of the call, DNS OARC, for their long-term support, which is, as ever, very much appreciated. Right, so focus for today is going to be on the highlights from the ICANN 86 Policy Forum. So just to explain, anyone that was expecting a discussion on the DNS tab here, we will do that, but I think for the project team that was sort of struggling to confirm a date, and I think because of the midsummer holiday in Scandinavia, that's just caused confusion. So when they're back from that, I'll get another date on the schedule. So we will revisit that, because certainly from the presentation in, I think it was OARC, it's a really interesting project which definitely warrants more discussion. But yeah, as I say, in the meantime, we're going to talk about the ICANN Policy Forum in a extremely hot Seville. We just talked about the weather sort of 2 weeks ago. Average about 35, 36 degrees each day. So very hot, very sunny. So we talk about that then, as always, recent developments, etc. Just scanning in the list of who's on. Don't think anyone that's currently on was in Seville, but if you were, or if you attended remotely and have opinions to share, then do just jump in as I'm walking through, just sharing my my views. But just a reminder, the Policy Forum is one of the three main meetings that ICANN hosts through the year, as well as a bunch of other smaller meetings, but it's one of their three major events through the year. It's smaller than the AGM, so roughly 1,300, just over people on site, so a decent number, and a large number, over sort of 500 attending virtually, so sort of 1,800, 1,900 total attended through the week. 116 sessions took place across the 4 days of the meeting. Main themes, well, the main one was DNS abuse, some references to the new GTLD program, which is open at the moment. So your opportunity to acquire your own personal GTLD if you're feeling wealthy, because you do need to pay for the privilege. But to say, DNS abuse being the main one, so universal acceptance of non sort of standard sort of Western European character sets being another significant one, or non-Anglo character sets, I should be, being another sort of main theme that came up, and with a sort of touch of AI leaking into the agenda this time around, which was different to the meeting in Mumbai in mid-March. So it was interesting to see how the community reacted to sort of AI, how it had affected its thinking, which I'll come back to in a bit. So what I'm going to do is just for each of the 4 days, just talk to the sessions that I went to. As I say, I'm not sure if anyone on the call joined either in person or remotely any of the sessions, but if you do, feel free to jump in at any point with your views, either on the sessions I was in or on others that you attended that I didn't. Yeah, so looking at Monday, the 8th of June first, I went to the non-commercial stakeholder group, NCSG. So you see a lot of initials like that for ICANN sessions. It's mainly civil society groups, not exclusively, but principally civil society groups of various types. The main focus of that particular discussion was how to protect the human rights of registrants So the owners of domains, in particular, there's something called associated domain checks. So in the event that a domain I own is found to be used for phishing attacks, let's say, for the sake of argument, then one of the ways that the community wants to mitigate DNS abuse is to then potentially consider which other domains I've registered, with a view to potentially suspending those in case they're also being used for DNS abuse. And as I say, NCSG is particularly concerned about my privacy rights in that event and whether those would be infringed in order to carry out that type of investigation. And therefore proposed a human rights impact assessment being conducted prior to such activity being kicked off. And we returned to this theme several times, which was, that's fine, but how do you balance the human rights of registrants against those of potential victims of DNS abuse, including things like, well, in the case of the fairly tight definition of ICANN, fraud and phishing and spam and so on. And needless to say, certainly in that session, we didn't necessarily fully agree. There were sort of differences of view, but we did return to that topic at various points through the week, and I'll come back to that at the end of day 4. Also, Philippe Foucault, who's often on this call, joined. He chairs the ISP and CP, so that's ISP and Connectivity Providers Membership Group, and he kindly invited me to give a presentation on fraud and CSAM and how that might pose a threat to ICANN's multi-stakeholder model, sorry. I shared some facts and figures about the scale of those two types of abuse, one of which is certainly within scope, within ICANN's definition of abuse. In terms of fraud, CSAM isn't, because it doesn't consider content when it looks at DNS abuse. My hypothesis being that governments are becoming increasingly impatient to see action and are increasingly likely, and in fact are, taking unilateral action, and potentially that will make ICANN and similar communities far less relevant to the debate, because if politicians are under pressure to do something, they can't take several years to reach consensus before possibly doing anything. But anyway, you can watch that presentation if you're interested in the recording and draw your own conclusions. But yeah, I appreciate it's a challenge, and I am a fan of the multi-stakeholder process, but that's one of its weaknesses, is the time it takes to make decisions. The prize for the busiest session of the week, though, was the final one on Monday afternoon, which was on the current and coming impact of AI on DNS abuse. And it was literally, well, I say standing or sitting on the floor room only. So much like some of the recent AI themed side meetings at the ITF, very much oversubscribed interest. There was a panel discussion. So it's good to see the topic formally on the agenda at this meeting, because as I say, it wasn't discussed really at all 3 months ago in Mumbai, so that was definitely progress. It does feel like it's a topic that the community has been quite slow to engage with, and I think the brief that the panel discussion focused on was very tightly focused, and I think because of that, they were rather too optimistic about how AI, agentic AI in particular, is a tool that will benefit defenders more than attackers. I have to say, at the RSA conference in March, which is totally focused on cybersecurity, they were very much of the opposite opinion. And in my view, at the moment, the evidence supports that stance, i.e. that it's more likely to favour attackers than defenders. Anyway, to illustrate why I thought they were too narrowly focused just on DNS abuse, they didn't consider, for example, if a malicious actor wanted to launch a significant a campaign that, amongst other things, abuse the DNS, they would probably in parallel do things like attack the systems of registries and registrars, because those are the main places where any mitigation actions take place. So if you take down their systems, then you're going to delay any mitigation action being launched. And obviously, the longer your campaign stays live, the bigger the impact it can have. So, as I say, I think the community is too optimistic in there at the moment, and probably needs to bring in more voices with more and sort of deeper AI and cybersecurity expertise. I think that to sort of challenge the accepted wisdom. Yeah, and as I said, I'll run through this. So jump in if you got any questions, as Michael's just done in the chat. So perfect timing. Are there any more? Is there any enthusiasm for more hurdles on domain registration before it goes live, like time verification, etc.? Yes, but only to a limited extent, Michael. And in fact, actually, the segues perfectly onto this slide. Hold that thought. I will answer that momentarily. So Tuesday morning, I spent the whole morning in the Government Advisory Committee. So this is, in terms of multi-stakeholder groups at ICANN, this is the government stakeholder group. And it's really, I mean, they have various discussions. It's like a parallel track, but they cover various topics, have presentations from others in the community, so you can get a sense of where their minds are at. Two things they talked about. First was something called the review of the reviews, which is just ICANN's rather clumsy title for. It's looking at its own operating principles and processes to see whether there can be some housekeeping in there. One of the standout points was, though, that some of the review intervals, certainly that were suggested, they're not agreed yet in the presentation and discussion, were to review on a sort of 15-year cycle, and then potentially with a 2-year review process. Which felt to me like that's extraordinarily long to think, every 15 years we'll take a look at this thing, and probably, 5 years seems like a long time, 15 years seems ridiculous. So, but that maybe just is a cultural thing, when you have bureaucrats in charge, I don't know, but yeah, that seemed extraordinary. More usefully, and coming back to Michael's question though, the second session of the morning was on registration data issues and accuracy of registration data, which kind of addressed that whole thing about the whole replacement for WHOIS in the sort of post-GDPR world. So what data should be captured and made available either publicly or on request to law enforcement agencies. So yes, they are looking at that, but certainly the registrars in particular seem very reluctant to do a lot when it comes to validation, and they really seem to be mainly focused just on validating the authenticity of a given email address, which yes, as Eric has helpfully put in the chat, I am not a crook at proton.me. Yes, burner email addresses are a thing. Who knew? So yeah, simply sending me an email back to confirm that that is in fact the email that I am or is a valid email at that moment in time, I think is of limited use, although it's not as ineffective as you might imagine. I was certainly surprised, and I'll come back to that. But it felt to me like the registrars were pushing a line of not doing a lot in that, and questioning whether even that was worth doing. And I think I'll come back to that on the next slide. So bear with me, I will revisit that. Whereas conversely, there was also a really useful session in the afternoon looking at regulatory trends on DNS resilience affecting CCTLDs, so country code TLDs, which, if I'm honest, I mean, because they did a review of some of the sort of main regulatory developments in different jurisdictions around the world. I thought the information was just as relevant to sort of GTLDs as it was to CCTLDs, but it happened to be held by the group that's responsible for the CCTLD registries. So yeah, it was quite useful. So a helpful summary, if you want a little memoir, the things that have happened recently in sort of regulatory areas. Moving on to day 3, and I will return to that topic in a second. A useful session between ICANN's non-commercial stakeholder group, that's the sort of civil society grouping, and the Security and Stability Advisory Committee. So they're focused, as the name implies, on maintaining the security and stability of the DNS. It was, and again, the NCSG team sort of presented on human rights impact assessments for various sort of policy-rated things ICANN is doing, but got some pushback from the ESAC members wanting to see more balance. So that was quite encouraging to get that pushback in my view. That balance between sort of human rights of the registrant mainly versus any potential victims. Then coming back to the discussion with GAC, this is on the Wednesday now, they looked at DNS abuse mitigation, and again, amongst others, there was a presentation from registrars, and they were mainly discussing the limitations of mitigation methods, and talked particularly about registrant verification and how that had a very limited effect on DNS abuse. And I was really surprised about that, because I've seen at least 3 lots of research, one of which ironically was presented also in the afternoon, all of which show, in my view, an extremely clear correlation between identity verification of a registrant and a reduction in DNS abuse, or the risk of DNS abuse. So I was surprised to hear the registrars take that line so explicitly, and if I'm honest, a bit disappointed that there wasn't more pushback from the GAC community to really sort of probe why they thought that, given available research. But then in the afternoon, the ESAC, so Security and Stability Advisory Committee, had a series of really interesting lightning talks. So 3 different presentations, each quite sort of short. I've called out 2 of the 3, rather than covering all 3, but to be fair, all 3 were quite interesting. Raphael Somesi gave the 3rd of the 3, which I haven't listed, looking at the Piracy Shield legislation in Italy, but since he's given a presentation about that on this call, I focused on the other 2. And I probably will completely get the name wrong, but Chao Yi Lu, summarised 20 research papers. So he was asked to look at research papers from the last year that touched on security-related matters or security matters as they relate to the DNS. So he gave very much a quick tour of all 20 papers, sort of highlighted the different themes, amongst other things, and summarised the main findings. And he is going to come onto this call to sort of reprise some of that, because I thought it was really useful. But one of the things that those pieces of research did look at find that there was a correlation between DNS abuse and effectively registrant validation, amongst other things, and in fact aspects that this particular piece of research highlighted were, if you've got an API allowing bulk registrations, perhaps without any rate limiting, that's advantageous for DNS abuse, as is low pricing, because clearly if you're registering very high volumes, the lower the price, the better, as is acceptance of cryptocurrency. Because depending on the cryptocurrency, again, that can be very helpful in disguising who you are. Whereas even just validating an email address and or mobile phone number had a marked impact in reducing the risk of DNS abuse. So even though, as was commented in the chat, you can get sort of burner email addresses, surprisingly, even at that step, maybe it's just the friction in the system, seems to sort of dampen down the level of abuse. And clearly, if you have more thorough know your customer type processes, then so much the better. Also, Greg Aaron from Interisle Consulting Group, they've done some original research looking at the level of malicious domain registrations in 2025. Rather depressingly, their research suggests that 20% or possibly more of all GTLD registrations last year were to known bad actors. So people that were known to be involved in malicious activity. The reason why I say possibly more, that was the lower bound of their research estimate. And clearly, depending on the bad actors, some of them do like to age the domains before they start to use them. So if it's already showing at least 20%, that number's likely to tick up over time. And then there was a discussion towards the end of Wednesday. There's a panel discussion with two registrars, just showing some of their experiences of tackling DNS abuse. The two registries, coincidentally, both were CCTLD operators, both from Scandinavia, one from Sweden, one from Norway. Apparently that was a coincidence. They were the first two to volunteer, so there wasn't any particular reason for picking two Scandinavian ones, but both of them have low DNS abuse rates, and they talk through some of the measures that they have that have led to that. In fairness, I think it was the Norwegian registry probably has some unique aspects, such as you have to be, I think, either a Norwegian citizen or a Norwegian registered company in order to register a .no domain. So that in itself would have a dampening effect on abuse versus some of the global bad actors. So there were some things that perhaps aren't necessarily very applicable elsewhere, but there were, nevertheless, they both have very low abuse rates, and talk through some of the things they do that have led to that. And then finally on Thursday, so the 11th of June, so the last day of the event, there was a sort of a discussion between SSAC and the contracted parties house, that's the registrars and registrars. which felt a bit self-congratulatory. But they both seem very happy with progress being made to develop policies to actually mitigate DNS abuse. So there wasn't a lot of challenge, and that maybe would have been helpful to just really push, see, well, what else could we do and how could we do it more quickly. Whereas there was then something called the Europe space, which, because the meeting was in Europe, it was mainly intended for sort of participants based in Europe, although there was no restriction on that. So they focused on matters that were especially relevant to European stakeholders, and looked at things like government mandated blocking of content, whether it's through the DNS or through IP blocking. In my view, they did rather ignore that, because of steps that were being deliberately made to limit the effect of other options. It's almost forcing governments and regulators towards things like IP blocking, and therefore we shouldn't then be surprised if there's overblocking or collateral damage, particularly if those claims made by CDN operators that have chosen to co-locate content or host servers on the same shared IP addresses. But anyway, yeah, it was a useful discussion running through a range of sort of Europe-specific things. So those of you based in Europe could find that of interest. There was an open mic session between the SSAC, so that's the Security and Stability Committee, and the root server operators. Again, it was open mic, so it's whatever people wanted to raise. Two things that came. But to me, it felt again like we're underestimating the impact of AI on the ecosystem. In this case, if there is this significant ramp up in the number of domains being registered for agentic AI, whether that's going to overload the sort of back office systems of registries and more likely registrars, which I think is certainly possible for some of the smaller operators. And also, they didn't feel as informed as I would have liked when it came to things like likely time frame for quantum computing, viable quantum computing. And certainly, and this is certainly not down to the ICANN, feels like we are behind the curve on adopting post-quantum cryptography. But as I say, a lot of that's more in the sort of domain of the ITF than it would be ICANN, in fairness. And then final one, and then I'll stop talking and see if anyone's got any other comments or questions. It was just a wrap-up session for the NCSG. Again, this is the civil society sort of group. And interestingly, the conclusion for the session, I'm a bit biased, but seemed to be that when you actually look at where and how you can apply human rights impact assessments, it's such a sort of a very narrow percentage of likely cases that it's not that relevant, and certainly didn't warrant being discussed repeatedly through this meeting, and in fact in Mumbai as well. So it seems to be much more of an edge case applicability when you actually get down to it. But let me just pause there and to see if anyone's got any comments or questions. So I'll stop sharing for a moment and pause for breath and see if anyone wants to jump in with anything from that before I sort of move on to some of the stuff that's happened over the last week or so. See a bit of a discussion about the privacy of registrants versus need to validate. Comments from Michael, Ed, Tom and David. To be honest, I think a lot of industries seem to have solved that problem with well-defined and practiced know your customer type processes. So I think we're possibly overstating how difficult it is, or whether it's a case of the cost of doing it is a deterrent for some of the registrars, perhaps. But yeah, if no one's got any other comments or wants to come in, I will plough on. Okay, let me reshare then, and I'll look at what's happened over the last week or so, just some of the news events, of which, as always, have been quite a few. And as always, I'm not going to go through all of these because it would take too long. And if you're not on the mailing list to get these directly Monday morning, let me know. I'll happily add you to the mailing list. Yeah, amongst other things, I mean, obviously they're biased, but ExpressVPN just put out a piece saying that actually you ought to switch off DoE if you're using a VPN, specifically their VPN. Their rationale being that you're leaking DNS sort of information that otherwise their VPN would take care of. So you may inadvertently be causing yourself a problem, which was interesting because often people will have both enabled potentially. And I think they find it difficult to disable, so we're asking people to disable it themselves in browsers and such like if you want to use their VPN. Yeah, so that was that one. A couple of other things. Andre from ISC gave a talk during the last RIPE meeting about how many DNS queries does it take to resolve one name, and I think the answer in his presentation was a lot more than most people realised. So whether it was because of that or maybe separately, Jeff Houston from APNIC sort of put a post on the APNIC blog last week looking at the extent to which resolvers generate duplicate queries. So maybe not exactly the same thing, but in broadly the same sort of space. And the answer is potentially a very large number. It does vary depending on the resolver that you're using, but I thought it was a nice quote in his post. It's often said of the DNS that it's a system that simply could not work in any usable manner were it not for caching, or in just case caching. Not only does caching suppress DNS query volumes and improve DNS response times, but caching can also mask over many forms of otherwise anomalous resolver behavior, such as multiple duplicate queries. So yeah, an interesting piece of research, certainly worth a look. Yeah, so that caught my eye. I think there was various other bits and pieces. A nice piece from our Infoblocks on sort of taking down a sort of piece of malware with details of some indicators of compromise linked to that. But the other one I wanted to highlight Kathleen Moriarty, who many of you will know either from the ITF or indeed on this call, has looked at the impact of AI and also of continuous integration and continuous delivery on vulnerability management, and has suggested that it's time to reconsider the sort of CVE process. And coincidentally, there was a couple of other articles in the same general space, one from RIPE NCC on what they learned from a multi-service vulnerability disclosure, and also from Dark Reading on stressors AI forcing changes to cybersecurity teams. So yeah, I know that again this issue was raised at RIPE around the sort of concerns that vulnerability reporting was flooding software companies, particularly open source developers. And I think if you look at sort of Kathleen's article and others, in my view, it's suggesting that we just need to accept that the environment has changed and need to adapt to suit that changed environment, rather than assuming things might revert back to what we're using for. Rather than assume it's going to revert back to what we were used to previously. I've seen the chat Michael, you've lost audio, but others haven't. Has it come back for you? Hopefully it has. Yeah. I think just we'll put that down to the internet. Yeah, one of the joys of the system. There's lots of other interesting stuff, definitely not at all DNS related, such as final meeting of a special panel on child online safety in the EU, which I think is probably the precursor to further action on sort of child online protection, which is definitely the direction of travel at the moment. An interesting piece on the internet after advertising and how the AI is forcing a new content economy, because obviously if you're being disintermediated by AI, then you can't easily rely on advertising revenue anymore. And also a nice piece in Circle ID, just a reminder, choose the location, a country where you locate your web hosts wisely. And the example they give, which is as good as any, is yes, it may be located in the EU, so you might think you're protected by GDPR, but if it's a US host operator, then they're also covered by the Cloud Act, unless they're in, is it Norway, I think, where they have got some mitigations for that. Norway or Switzerland, not that Switzerland's in the EU itself. And a whole bunch of other things as always, so plenty of stuff happening over the week. Other things, if you were thinking of responding to a consultation from the EU on its draft guidelines for classification of high-risk AI systems, then that closes tomorrow. So you've got roughly 24 hours to get your response in. And if you're planning to present at APNIC 62 later in the year, then you've got roughly a week, I think a week tomorrow, to respond to their call for papers. So just a reminder of those coming up, and then it's a couple of weeks away still, but early July, the ITF 126 early rate closes and you go on to the standard rate. So if you're planning to attend in person or online, you can save, again, I think it's a couple $100 if you're going in person by registering before the 6th of July, even though you've missed the super early rate, which would have been even cheaper. And I should also, just as a general reminder, if you're planning to attend online, then there are unlimited fee waivers if the cost of registration is a problem for you. Sorry, Ed, you've got your hand raised. If you raised it earlier and I missed it, apologies, it just caught my eye.
That's right. This is the kind of thing that just catches my eyes. On the previous slide,
Sure.
one of the things you didn't highlight, you had an article about Apple, but the link goes to Microsoft. Safari's Privacy Fortress. It's the third one, the one after the
Okay.
one. I don't think it
So it
matters,
does.
but it doesn't matter. I was just, anyway.
I
So
will, thank you, well spotted. I will fix that before I share it. No idea how that happened, but it won't do when I share the slides. So thank you for highlighting that, and good spot. Eagle-eyed Ed, I think. I'm impressed. Yeah, so that's what I was going to say, just in terms of imminent deadlines. There's other things on the horizon, but a bit further off. Various events through to the end of July. Then we have the, certainly for Europe, it gets a little bit quieter for a while. But you'll see next week there's an interim SEC dispatch session for the ITF, just to pick up the slack from stuff that wasn't properly discussed at the last meeting because of some of the issues with remote access, I think with Meet Echo generally, and the local network. That's an interim session, even though it's very close to the next meeting. And then, as you can see, early July, there's an AI for Good meeting in Geneva, follow-up from the, I think, extremely oversubscribed meeting. Took place similar time last year, which filled the available capacity at the ITU buildings in Geneva. So yeah, very popular session last year. And then before you know it, we'll be heading off to Vienna, some of us at least, for ITF 126, which is coming around in roughly a month's time. So rather soon now. Okay, last thing from me, and then I'll stop talking, see if anyone's got any other business, is next week we're talking about catalog zone extensions with a panel discussion, which Alexei is pulling together. I'll confirm the final panel makeup, obviously, prior to the meeting, but that should be an interesting session with a range of people, which may include some or all of those listed on the slide. So yeah, that should be quite interesting to see what comes up. So we'll do that this time next Monday. So with apologies for mainly talking at people for a while, let me stop sharing and see if anyone has got any other business or anything I've missed in the chat. I'm tempted to ask Eric if you wanted to elaborate on your comment on despair, but I'm not sure whether that was for discussion or just a rhetorical comment. So don't feel like you need to, unless you particularly want to, in which case you're most welcome.
All right, you asked.
Your voice is conveying the despair, I think.
I've been to a couple ICANNs where I can attend them, and I handed out a couple ideas of things that could be done, but it doesn't seem to be solved by ICANN. It'll perpetually, and perhaps they created it such that you always have the blind men around the elephant. So many different stakeholder groups can get in the way of something getting done. The whole thing about privacy that has been detrimental to who is and the people who collect who is. But the thing that security practitioners are more interested in is who's registering all those bulk domains, and can we have an identifier, anonymous, random number, something that just ties them together and makes it easily queryable? Nope, no, they won't. They don't do it. And the whole privacy thing, it's never going to be solved because there are so many people more concerned about. I don't know. I'm going to drift back into despair and go back, curl back into a ball, and it's the whole registration system is just not useful anymore, or as useful.
Yeah, I think I detect from your comments we're probably in broad agreement. Both in terms of why the current system is broken, but also that it really should be a solvable problem. And if we look at other industries, they seem to have done things to address sort of very similar issues, in my view. But yeah, as I said earlier, I like the multi-stakeholder system in principle, but I think this is one of the instances where the practicalities of getting some consensus become difficult. In fairness, though, as somebody pointed out to me, there's nothing stopping some of the individual stakeholder groups from taking action in specific areas. Sometimes people hide behind the multi-stakeholder model when in reality they could take action under their own volition, that you don't have to do things necessarily through the ICANN contracts. Maybe just treat it as a useful forum to identify things that need to be done, and then maybe take away the problems to solve elsewhere on occasion. But yeah, as I say, in my view, this is a solvable problem. It's largely down to will rather than inventing something, because we simply have to look at banking or other places to at least see where you could make inroads into the problem. So, answers on a postcard, most welcome from anyone. But for all that, I should have mentioned the next meeting was going to be in Oman, but has been relocated because of current issues in the Middle East. So sadly, it's going to be in Bali in November instead. I offer that up to anyone that might want to experience ICANN for the first time. There will be worse places to experience it than Bali, potentially. So I'll leave that as an exercise to the reader to pursue if you are interested. There is no registration fee, by the way, for ICANN meetings, but you obviously have to cover your travel and hotel expenses. Right, well, anyway, on that note, I hope that was useful. A reminder, we got the panel discussion on catalogue zones next week. So in the meantime, have a fantastic week. If you're in Europe, enjoy the sunshine and hopefully find ways to cool down as well. But have a brilliant week, and I look forward to catching up same time next week. So thanks, everyone. See you then.